Добрый вечер, дорогие участники встреч «Вне границ». Меня зовут Шахирана, я заместитель руководителя факультета психологии в Высшей школе «Среда, обучения». И я рада вас приветствовать на наших регулярных встречах «Вне границ» по вторникам в 19:00 по Москве, которые показывают, что в современных условиях, в современных реалиях мы можем независимо от времени и пространства погружаться в разные темы, которые могут быть более научные или более прикладные, и в такую действительно увлекательную и актуальную, как никогда, молодую науку психология. Сегодняшняя тема особенно актуальна в контексте изучения и представления системного о психологии, о развитии психики, о развитии поведения, потому что сегодня вместе с Корен Пичелло мы поговорим об основах эволюционной психологии, о том, как в целом поведение развивалось с точки зрения эволюции, потому что действительно это интересная история того, как мы приходим в точку здесь и сейчас, какой путь был пройден, потому что мы, находясь в 21 веке, да даже находясь в 20 веке, да, потому что часть родилась раньше, часть родилась позже из наших слушателей, мы по-разному можем оценивать наше поведение, поведение тех, кто нас окружает, поведение наших клиентов, представление наших клиентов о поведении других людей. И, конечно, с точки зрения эволюционной психологии есть ряд исследований, которые делают акцент особый на изучении закономерностей, которые мы можем наблюдать сейчас и которые развивались долгие-долгие годы. Поэтому сегодня я очень рада приветствовать Колина Пичелло из Университета Пенсильвании и передать ей слово в рамках встречи по эволюционным корням поведения. Напомню, что наша встреча будет проходить полчаса. В конце, после часа 15 общей встречи будет открыта сессия вопросов, поэтому если на протяжении сегодняшней встречи у вас будут возникать вопросы, а я уверена, что они будут возникать, не стесняйтесь их сразу писать в чат, я их все соберу, буду с вами на площадке, как обычно, на протяжении всей встречи, и в конце у вас будет возможность получить обратную связь по вашим вопросам от действительно настоящего профессионала своего дела. Успешной встречи и остаемся на связи. Передаю слово.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for this invitation. So as you all know, I'm going to be talking about the evolutionary origins of human cooperation. And what I want to focus on today is the derived aspects of our cooperative behavior. So those things that separate us from our closest relatives. And what I'll be doing is I'll largely be drawing on work from hunter-gatherers. So I'll start by presenting sort of a broad introduction to the topic, which might be review for some of you, but maybe not everybody. And then in the second half of the talk, what I'll do is I'll include my own data, work that I do with the Hadza, who are a population of hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. So what I first want to do is I want to start by rewinding the clock all the way back to the beginning, 4.6 billion years ago when our planet was first formed. And I think that this is a useful exercise for contextualizing our existence. So after the planet was formed, nothing happened for a really, really long time. It took a whole billion years before we see life, before we see single-celled organisms. But another 2.5 billion years passes before we see the appearance of more complex multicellular animals. Mammals, they make their appearance about 250 million years ago. Hominids, the great apes and their ancestors, well, they arrive on the scene about 15 to 20 million years ago. And what about Homo sapiens? What about us? Well, we arrived to the party pretty late, only about 250, 300,000 years ago. So our species is extraordinarily young. And this has led some to call humans nothing more than a microscopic blip in time. In other words, if we were to condense the history of the Earth into a 12-hour period, Homo sapiens would not make their appearance within the last hour, not within the last minute, but within the last second. So this is just a brief flash in time. And exercises like this are often used to illustrate how insignificant we are, how small we are. But for me, it has the opposite effect. Even though we have been around for such a short amount of time, we have accomplished so much. So in biological terms alone, our species is remarkably successful. So since the advent of agriculture around 10, 12,000 years ago, the human population has increased 1,000-fold, over 1,000-fold. And if you look at doubling time, so this is the number of years required for the world population to just double in size. Well, you can see here, at the beginning of the present era, it would take an estimated 1,800 years for that to happen, for the population to double. But by the year 2000, that decreased to just 40 years. So really fast now. The human population has not only grown, but it's spread out as well. And I think this photograph of Earth captures this idea nicely, that human activity is found everywhere. We can be found in diverse habitats all over the planet. So we might be this, microscopic blip in temporal terms. We're not insignificant. We are all over the planet, and for better or for worse, I might say, we are reshaping it. And this has led some geologists to conclude or to say that humans themselves are a geological event, not so dissimilar to something like an asteroid impact, that we are now living in the Anthropocene, the age of humans. And again, all of this happened in less than 1/10 of a second. So how did we manage not only to, dominate the planet, but how did we do it in such an incredibly short amount of time? What was this recipe for our success? Well, cooperation is largely agreed to be a key ingredient. So when we cooperate in the pursuit of, shared goals, what we can do is we can achieve a whole lot more. We can achieve extraordinary things that no one individual could ever accomplish on their own. And then you combine this with other ingredients, our advanced cognitive capabilities, which allow us to communicate with others, to plan for the future. And you add to this mix culture, our capacity to learn from one another, to pass on information and knowledge to each other, and also down generations. So we have cumulative knowledge. And those ingredients make a perfect recipe for success. And anthropologists have labeled this the 3 C's. And I think it's really easy to see how cognition and culture can enhance the utility of our cooperative relationship. So the potential benefits of cooperating, they just increase dramatically once you become smart, once you have social learning. And this is what allows us to do things like, build societies and complex institutions, create and distribute vaccines all over the planet, and even just to travel beyond our own planet. The 3 C's are why we are living in the age of humans. And I'm particularly interested, as you all know, in one of those, cooperation. And as you might have anticipated, compared to other animals, human cooperation is different. It's unique. It stands out in both its scope and also in its scale. So what do I mean by that? Well, humans cooperate in lots of different situations, a diverse range of situations, and with a diverse range of individuals. So our cooperation extends beyond our relatives. It extends beyond our friends. It includes strangers, people that we may never even meet. And in terms of scope, well, we can, cooperate in these partnerships or even just small groups, but our cooperation can also scale up to include hundreds of individuals, thousands, or even millions of individuals. And it's not to say that other mammals don't cooperate, they do. But among social mammals, what you tend to find is that cooperation tends to be limited to one's relatives. So even in chimpanzees, these are our closest relatives, there's this real divide in levels of cooperation. Generally, what you tend to find is that cooperation is limited to group members, particularly kin, families, and reciprocating partners. You just don't see chimpanzees really, sharing the same levels of concern or consideration for the well-being of others as you do with humans. Humans care about other people. What you tend to find in laboratory studies with chimpanzees, not true of every study, but most studies, is that chimpanzees generally make their decisions or their choices based on what they're going to get, right? Their own personal gain, with very little consideration to what happens to others, so the outcomes of other individuals. And time after time, what you find with humans is that we care about the welfare of others. And we know this because we can just go out and observe everyday behavior and see this, but we can measure this too using incentivized games from economics and psychology, such as the dictator game. So this is just a very simple measure of self-sacrifice. So this is one of the simplest games out there. How much are you willing to give up in order to benefit someone else? And the rational self-interested thing to do is to give nothing. But that's not what people do in this game. So what you tend to find is that in industrialized societies, median and modal offers tend to be about 40 to 50% of the pot. And when you look at gameplay in diverse societies around the world, you can see that humans everywhere give something, right? So this figure here just shows the distributions of offers in the dictator game. So here on the x-axis is the percentage of the stake offered. And these horizontal gray bars that you can see here going up here represents the mean offers for each of these different populations, each of these groups here. And what you can see just by eyeballing this is that, yeah, there's variation, right? You can see that there's differences among these different populations, but there are no societies in which individuals are completely selfish, right? Even in the lowest, right, which happens to be the population that I work with, so the lowest offers here, people are still giving, away on average about 20% of their pot, right? So that's quite a big deal. So while there's this, consensus that cooperation, it's important, it's an important aspect of our psychology, it's a key ingredient to our success, the consensus breaks down when we try to understand or figure out how cooperation evolved. And this has been described by many as a puzzle, one of biology's great puzzles. And even Darwin regarded the existence of altruism as a major problem or challenge to his theory of natural selection. So here's the puzzle that Darwin is referring to, and others that have talked about this in terms of puzzles. So when you have a population of cooperators, so these are all the cooperators here. So you have a population of cooperators, and what happens is a defector enters the group, maybe by a mutation or migration or something. What is going to happen is that these defectors will enjoy the benefits of the cooperation, right? Of being around all these cooperative individuals without having to pay the costs. So they're going to benefit, they're going to do better. And so over time, because they're going to do better, what's going to happen is selection is going to favor them over the cooperators. And eventually, because the cooperators are taken, advantage of, the cooperators will become extinct. So you get a population of defectors. So that's the puzzle. The good news is that there have been many mechanisms proposed to solve this puzzle. These are 4 broad classes that I'm listing here. I would say that it's, in some ways, it's not even a puzzle anymore because we have a surplus of solutions. We have lots of ways to solve this problem. I'm listing the most prominent mechanisms here, but this list isn't exhaustive. And I would say that the real challenge now is figuring out, well, which of these theories, right? Which of these mechanisms here, and there might be more than one, make the most sense for explaining the derived or the unique features of human cooperation. So the most well-known ones here and widely accepted are kin selection and reciprocity. I'm sure many of you have heard these. I'm not going to spend that much time in describing them because I'm sure they are pretty familiar. So this is the most prevalent form of cooperation in nature, kin selection. And here you just direct your cooperation to those individuals who share the same genes as you. So R here is relatedness. And because you're benefiting from cooperating, what's going to happen is that if you're helping this individual, they share genes with you, well, those cooperative genes are likely to get passed on. And so over many generations, you get more cooperation, right? You get cooperation evolving, you get more cooperative individuals. The logic of direct reciprocity, it's also simple. You do something for someone else, and if they pay you back, well, you're both going to benefit, right? So you've got reciprocity here. Someone does something for someone else, they get paid back, both benefit, and those cooperative genes that led them to that behavior get passed on, and they do better than these individuals, right? Because they're not cooperating, they're not benefiting from this. And this mechanism assumes that for cooperation to evolve, you need repeated encounters with people. So this is important. There needs to be repeated encounters between individuals, and they need to see each other again and again in order to get that, to get paid back and to get that benefit. And there's been a lot of theoretical work designed to understand this. And this theoretical work suggests that this works really well in two-person cooperative situations where individuals are likely to interact over and over again many times. But it tends to break down as groups get bigger, right? As they increase in size. So these two-person, results don't tend to generalize as you scale up to groups of over, say 10 individuals or so. Then we have these partner choice models. And these are models where people compete for the most cooperative partners. And the most cooperative individuals end up choosing each other as partners. So you can think of this like a marketplace, right? Where individuals are interacting, they're kind of like sizing each other up, like what kind of person are you, and so forth, trying to figure out what each other's types are. And they're trying to pair up with the most cooperative person that will also accept them in return. So if this is a little unclear, I'll give you a little illustration here. This is an example. So this individual is very cooperative. He's offering a lot of goods in this situation here. And all these three individuals want to team up with him and be his friend because he's bringing a lot of money to the table. He gets to choose, since he's in high demand, who he would like to pair up with. And he's going to choose this woman here because she's also offering more than these two. So these two are going to pair up with one another, leaving these two no choice to either, hang out by themselves or pair up with each other. So here what you see cooperative individuals, the most cooperative, pairing up with each other, and they're going to benefit the most because they are so cooperative, and over time, their selection is going to favor them over individuals who are less cooperative. Okay, and then the final class of mechanisms is the cultural evolutionary mechanisms, which could lead to group selection. So the idea here is that we are a cultural species. We acquire our ideas, our beliefs, our values from our social worlds, from the people around us. And in these models, culture and the adoption of social norms can create variation between groups in levels of cooperation. So we can just see that there are groups that are more cooperative and less cooperative. And those groups with more cooperative norms will do better and they'll be more successful. And those groups will grow and grow and eventually displace the less cooperative groups. So like, partner choice, there's lots of support for these models as well. So again, as I, showed you, we find variation, within and between societies and levels of cooperation, and they have been associated with, different things, various institutions like exposure to markets, religions, and so forth. So again, here you have a cooperative group, you have a less cooperative group. Norms are determining these levels of cooperation. This group is going to do better because they're cooperative and everyone's benefiting from that. And so the group will grow, and eventually over time, they'll replace this other group. Okay, what I want to draw your attention to is that all of these mechanisms solve the puzzle in the same way. They rely on the same basic principle of positive assortment, such that cooperation preferentially flows between those who cooperate, so that defectors don't benefit from that behavior. There has to be a mechanism that keeps defectors from benefiting, and only cooperators from benefiting from the cooperation. And all of these mechanisms do that. You see positive assortment, they're solving it in exactly the same way. You see that they're solving it through positive assortment. So you see here, green is with green, green is with green, green is with green, and green is with green. So you get positive assortment. So all of these mechanisms can lead to that. So again, there's lots of theories out there that solve the problem of cooperation, but we know very little about how our ancestors actually solved this problem, right? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to evaluate each of these mechanisms in light of what we know about hunter-gatherers. And I'm going to argue that I think it's particularly useful to study cooperation within the context of hunter-gatherer life. So even though humans haven't been around for that long, for the vast majority of their existence, or our existence, we've lived as hunter-gatherers, right? We've lived a hunter-gatherer way of life. So it's estimated that about 50,000 generations of differential survival, reproduction took place in a hunter-gatherer way of life. So much of our psychology likely evolved because it solved problems that our ancestors faced a long time ago. But because of their convenience, weird participants are often used as subjects in psychology research. So I'm sure many of you have heard this before. So these are individuals that are drawn primarily from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. But the problem is that these individuals represent a tiny fraction of the population that exists today, and even, just a sliver of the population that has ever existed. So cross-cultural work, and in particular work with hunter-gatherers, is, it's important because it offers us this means by which we can, evaluate the plausibility of each of these mechanisms in perhaps a more relevant context. Okay, let's revisit this game that I told you about, the dictator game. So remember that I showed you that people everywhere, right? Everywhere will help strangers, people they don't know, in anonymous situations. So anonymous means that there is no possibility that they can be repaid once they help somebody, right? So you help these strangers in anonymous situations. Well, this is a derived aspect of our psychology, something that humans do, but other animals don't do. So it's a derived aspect of our psychology, and it's not predicted by kin selection or direct reciprocity. So neither one of those theories make this prediction. According to these theories, right, according to kin selection and direct reciprocity, our psychology should be designed to just help our relatives, or to help our friends, people who will pay us back, right? We shouldn't be helping people who aren't going to pay us back, or people who aren't related to us, according to those theories. And for a long time, this observation that, people help strangers in these, one-shot situations, it wasn't viewed as a problem for these theories of, kin selection and direct reciprocity, because what researchers would do is they would evoke what we call mismatch explanations. Now, mismatch explanations go like this. The idea is that our psychology is calibrated, right? Our psychology is calibrated to ancestral conditions of, hunter-gatherer life, which consisted, they say, of small, stable groups of closely related individuals, right? So basically, they say, well, our psychology is designed for the past when we were living in these small groups and we stayed with our relatives and we stayed living with them forever. It's kind of a simplistic view of it. But now, because humans are interacting in larger groups, right, in more anonymous group settings, a change that, occurred very recently in evolutionary terms, natural selection just hasn't had time to basically catch up. It hasn't had time to modify our psychology. And that's the mismatch. We treat everyone around us, all our encounters, as though they're kin or somebody who is going to pay us back, a reciprocating partner. So people that believed in the kin selection and direct reciprocity theories, they would say, well, that's not really a problem because you have this mismatch between how we are today and how we were in the past. There are problems, though, with this mismatch explanation. So first, I'll just say that we don't know exactly what hunter-gatherers looked like in the past. A lot of it is speculative, and even, more so the further back in time you go. But it's generally agreed that there's just a lot of forager diversity out there in social organization, political organization, and structure. And that diversity may persist as far back as, 100,000 years or so. What this suggests is that at least some ancestral forager groups were unlikely to be composed of small, stable groups of mostly relatives, right? Also, when we look at hunter-gatherers for whom there, still exists reliable data, and this was a study that was done, this isn't my work, but with 32 different societies, and we can look to see, well, who are they living with, right? What we find is that relatedness is actually quite low, remarkably low. People aren't living with their close kin only. In fact, they're living with fewer of their close kin. Here are just two examples. This is the Ache of Paraguay and the Kung of Botswana. And what you can see here is that, primary kin, so these are people who share 50% of their DNA with one another, they make up a small proportion of who individuals are living with. The third problem with this mismatch explanation is that studies with current hunter-gatherers also show that migration, movement, tends to be high and residence is fluid, meaning that, many of these societies, relationships that people have with one another aren't stable, they're ephemeral, they're changing all the time. So we're not seeing these stable groups with the same individuals persisting, which is what those models of direct reciprocity require. So for example, in my data with the Hadza, when you track people from year to year, what you find is that people are on average living with only 1 in 5 of their prior campmates. So if you go 1 year to the next, you find that they're living with very few people, very few of the same people that they lived with before. And the last problem, many problems, the last one is that, groups are not small. So Nick Blurton-Jones, I guess you could call my academic grandfather. He was my late advisor's advisor. He spent years working with the Hadza, and he published this really beautiful book on Hadza demography and ecology. And it includes this, series of censuses over the last, 15 years or so. And he says it's completely wrong to think of these as like tiny isolated populations, right? These are actually much bigger if you really think about them. And another paper came out just a few years ago that reviewed the organization and size of various hunter-gatherer groups, included that, hunter-gatherer groups are not small, but instead they're big, right? Their social organization is big. They exist in these large-scale networks dominated primarily by links between non-relatives, right? People aren't related to each other. What does this mean? Well, this means to the extent, that the data that we have from hunter-gatherers can be used to, model the behavior of our ancestors, then this set of findings that I presented to you really challenge that mismatch explanation. And it undermines the extent to which kin selection and direct reciprocity can explain those more derived aspects of our psychology, right? Why we are willing to help people we don't know, who aren't going to give us anything in return for it. And again, I'm not saying that kin selection and direct reciprocity don't matter. They, of course, do. They're very powerful. These are some of the most prevalent forms of cooperation that you see in other animals. And they're important too, undoubtedly, in human evolution. And my own data says that, but rather, I think other explanations are necessary to explain our tendency to cooperate with strangers when there's no benefit to doing so. And why also there just exists so much variation in cooperative behavior around the world that needs some sort of explanation. Why do we see so much variation? So what I want to do now is focus more on these two newer classes of mechanisms. And in particular, I'm going to really focus on partner choice. And both of these mechanisms, again, can also generate the assortment that's necessary for cooperation to evolve. So for the remainder of our time together, I want to evaluate these latter two explanations using data from the Hadza. So with that said, let me tell you a little bit about the Hadza. They are a nomadic group of foragers that reside in northern Tanzania. There are about 1,000 individuals who identify as Hadza, though only 400 or so are still really subsisting by means of hunting and gathering. And it's that smaller subgroup that is the focus of my research. Now, the Hadza live in these temporary groups, and I call these camps. They number about 30 individuals or so, and camp residence, this is key to remember, is flexible. And individuals are frequently moving between camps, from one camp to the other. And likewise, entire camps will shift location every 6 to 8 weeks at a time as they use up resources in the area. So it's wrong to think of, a camp sort of being set in a geographic location and persisting through time. There's a camp at one point in time and it might never exist again. Food acquisition is characterized by a sexual division of labor where, men target animal-based resources, so birds, antelope, giraffe. They also collect honey, and women target plant-based foods. They'll gather berries, they'll dig for tubers. And the Hadza are, remarkably egalitarian. So acquired foods are brought back to camp and they're shared fairly evenly with everyone, with all camp members. And if packages are, sufficiently large, they get a big hill, right? Then they may be shared even with nearby camp members. I'll just quickly say that I think the Hadza are ideal for studying cooperation. They live in an environment where day-to-day survival necessitates high levels of cooperation in terms of food sharing, which I just discussed, childcare, and just helping those in need, helping the sick, helping the elderly. The Hadza also allow us to study cooperation in a setting where there aren't many centralized institutions to ensure that cooperation happens. There are no police, there are no courts, there are no written laws. And in fact, up until very recently, their belief in gods with moralizing concerns who can punish you So gods with moral eyes, they care how you treat other people, and they can punish you if you treat people badly. Well, their belief in that has been quite limited. And then finally, although they live in small groups and there are these strong norms for sharing, there are, of course, still opportunities to free ride, to cheat. And this can be achieved by expending less effort when you go out hunting and foraging, just not working so hard, or not sharing all of your food sources. So you can consume food before you bring it back to camp. And they can also conceal it under their clothing, under their garments. They can arrive back to camp late and hide under the cloak of darkness. Nobody can see them, and so forth. And there is data that I have that show that the Hadza, in fact, do bend the rules to benefit themselves when they can, when they're able to do so. So this is a game that I played with them called the random allocation game. What I did here is I gave participants 30 tokens worth some amount of food. And I gave them a 2-colored die. And then they had to go off into the distance without me watching them, so they would go far away. And they would need to distribute those 30 tokens between 2 cups. So they had 2 cups, 1 cup for them and 1 cup for another individual, an anonymous Hadza who is living in a faraway camp. And they had to do this, put the tokens in the cup based on the roll of the die. And so what you can see here is this is the binomial distribution in blue, right? And this is what you would get if people relied on the die as the mechanism generating the outcome, right? So you'd get most individuals about 14, 15, 16, 17 tokens would end up in their cup. But what you can see with the Hadza, which is the actual data in orange, this is how many tokens went into their own cup, they were getting a lot more tokens than expected, right? So there were some individuals where they got really lucky and all 30 tokens ended up in their cup. So the die fell on their color all 30 times, which is very, very unlikely. Okay, in my first project looking at cooperation in the Hadza, what I did is I measured each person's level of cooperation, who they were living with, and I mapped their social network. And this allows me to examine whether there is assortment on cooperation. That is, are cooperative people connected to each other? Are they connected to each other, and do they live together? And again, that's assortment, right? And this is fundamental to all of the theories. I can also examine whether cooperative people are more popular, which is, as you remember, an assumption of the partner choice models, and something that we do find in industrialized societies. So if you ask people, from the US, who would you like to partner with, this cooperative person or this less cooperative person, you get people preferring cooperative individuals. So this is data going back to 2010. In 2010, I visited 17 different Hadza camps and I interviewed all adults in each camp. And to map their social network, what I did is I compiled a picture database of the entire Hadza population. And I printed them out on these big poster boards and I showed them to people. And I simply just asked them, all of the individuals, to look at the photos and tell me, who would you like to live with after this camp ends? Who would you like to live with next? And they were told that they could choose people in the entire Hadza universe, anyone on the posters, and they could choose people that they currently live with or that they don't live with. It didn't matter. And they could nominate up to 10 people. For our measure of cooperation, what we had participants do is play a single round of a public goods game. So this is another game, a little different than the dictator game, but here what we're doing is we're using sticks of honey. This is a favorite food of the Hadza, so they love honey. And they were playing this game with other adult members in their camp. And in this game, what participants have to do is they have to secretly choose how many sticks of honey out of the 4 to put in the public pot versus keep for themselves. So I gave them 4 sticks of honey, and they could choose any amount between 0 to all 4 to put in the public pot. And for every stick of honey that they would put into that pot, I would add an additional 3 sticks of honey. And at the end of the game, the public honey, anything that was in that big box or big bag, would be distributed between all the individuals who played the game, everyone in the camp. And in this game, what you find is that if everyone, donates, everyone is better off collectively. But from any individual's perspective, they will do better if they don't contribute. So the first question, are similarly cooperative people connected? The answer is yes. So what we did is we calculated the absolute difference in honey sticks donated between every possible pair of individuals in Hodsland, in the network. And we found that if they were similar, they were more likely to be connected, meaning that one nominated the other as a campmate. So for instance, this individual donated 4 sticks of honey, and this individual did the same. They also donated 4 sticks of honey, so they're the same. And they're about 2.5 times more likely to be connected versus an a pair who is maximally different, where one donated all and the other donated nothing. So they're very different. Are generous Hadza chosen more as campmates? Well, the answer here is no. We didn't find any relationship here. And if anything, there was a slight negative relationship between the number of honey sticks donated and the number of times a person was nominated as a campmate. So for instance, an individual who donated 4 sticks of honey, this isn't significant, but it's just for illustrative purposes. The individual who donated, 4 sticks of honey is about 8% less likely to be nominated compared to the individual who, donated nothing. We also find that, similarly cooperative individuals are living together. So here are all the different camps that I visited. I color coded them, and each shape represents an individual. And what I've done is I've classified them into either high cooperators or low cooperators. So high cooperators are the circles and the low cooperators are the triangles. And I just did this so it's an easy way for you to visualize all the data here. But what you can see is that there are some groups that are composed of mostly, low cooperators and groups that are composed of mostly high cooperators. So there is this, assortment happening at the level of the camp. So we found that, Hadza life is structured in a way that really supports the evolution of cooperation. Cooperation preferentially flows to others who cooperate and not to those who don't. So people are living with cooperators. They're preferring to live with cooperators. However, the question still remains as to, well, how is this assortment happening? So just to review, partner choice models, partner selection models, assume that individuals have these stable, often inherited preferences. That is, there are some people who cooperate and there's some people who don't. There are good guys and bad guys, I guess. And then they choose each other and then they assort based on that, right? We're sizing each other up. You're a good person, I'm a good person. Let's go off and be friends, right? And this is akin to the idea that, I hope you have this saying, I'm not sure, but birds of a feather flock together. At least that's a saying in English. A second possibility is that assortment is explained by social influence. The idea that cooperative behavior changes, right? It changes as individual social environments change, right? As to fit local environments. And this would be consistent with theories of cultural evolution. And there are reasons you might think that partner choice would work really, really well in a setting like the Hadza, right? They are mobile, right? They move around, they're mobile hunter-gatherers. They might not be able to choose, who to share their food with within camps, right? Because food is shared widely, but they can choose who they want to live with. And there seems to be relatively little cost to moving. They own very few material possessions, and so it's very easy to just get up and leave if you are unhappy. On the other hand, there are reasons to think that the conditions of hunter-gatherer life may be less favorable to partner choice. So again, there are strong norms of egalitarianism. There's high levels of sharing, communal cooperation. And because groups are pretty small, people can monitor the behavior and ensure that it happens. What this means is that there might not be a lot of variation in observed levels of cooperation on which to choose campmates or partners, right? So if everyone is forced to cooperate, what are you really choosing on? Everyone's going to cooperate. And because there's so much cooperation happening, regardless of one's intention, I might not want to cooperate, but I'm going to have to cooperate because I'm going to be forced to. What might become more important is whether they even have the food, right, to share in the first place, whether they can actually get the food in the first place. That might become a more relevant metric. So I might be very willing to cooperate, but if I'm a terrible hunter, terrible forager, I'm not going to have any food, and therefore you're not going to get any. I might not be a very good partner compared to someone who doesn't really want to cooperate, doesn't want to share food, but they're an excellent hunter. They're really good. They bring back food and everyone's going to force them to share it. You might prefer them as a partner compared to me. And indeed, this is really what biological market theory, predicts more generally, that people are going to compete for partners or compete on any dimension, right? Any trait that increases their value as a partner. So it doesn't have to be cooperation. You might not want to compete for cooperative people. You might want to compete for the best hunter, to live with the best hunter or something. Okay, so to tease apart those two classes of explanation, the cultural evolutionary sorts of explanations and the partner choice explanations, my collaborators and I collected longitudinal data to track cooperative behavior in residents over a 6-year period. And in total, we have 4 years of data from 56 camps comprising nearly 400 unique individuals, and for many of them, we have data from 2 or more years. And this is the same figure that I showed you for 2010, and now what I'm doing is I am including it for all the other years. So that was the data that I showed you in 2010. Now you can see data for 2013, 2014, and 2016. And what you can see is that assortment is happening, in every year that you look at the data. You have people who are cooperating more, and you have groups of people who are cooperating less. So you see here, you've got this group of high cooperators, you got this group of low cooperators, and you see this assortment in every year that you look at it. Now, here's the really interesting thing about this. This is why I know it's a lot of data on one page, but I just like to show everything. Remember I told you that Hadza residence is flexible. Well, you can see this here. So in 2010, what I've done is I've colored everyone based on their membership, their current camp membership, who they were living with in 2010. And then in every subsequent year, individuals are colored based on their camp membership in the prior year. So these are the individuals. So this individual lived here this year, and now they're living here with all these new individuals. The gray people, anyone who's in gray, are just people that I didn't encounter from a prior year. So what you can see is that individuals are largely living with new people year to year. 1 in 5 of their campmates is somebody that they lived with before. So largely new people every year. So although camp composition is changing, the people in the camps continue to be similar to one another, right? Suggesting the only way for that to happen is that people's levels of cooperation are changing each year. And you can see this happening. So we don't actually find any evidence for stable cooperative types, suggesting that people are changing their levels of cooperation every year. So how an individual behaves in one year does not predict how they behave in a future year. So this figure, what it does is it plots current yearly contributions, so how many honey sticks they donated, by the contributions made in the next consecutive year, right? And the gray circles here are just proportional to the count of individuals. The blue is the mean. And what you would expect if there were cooperative types, that people were the same year to year, right? That there were good guys and bad guys and people don't change, is that most people would fall in this, this diagonal line, right? So if you donated nothing in year one, in year two, you would also donate nothing. If you were very generous in year one, right, you would also be really generous in year two. And so most people will follow along this if there were stable cooperative types. The data suggests that that is not the case. Instead, what we find is that the strongest predictor of an individual's level of cooperation in every single year that we looked at this is the average level of cooperation of their campmates in that year. So for each additional honey stick contributed by camp members, what you find is that participants contributed on average an additional half stick of honey. And this is a pretty strong relationship. And this result is one that survives all sorts of robustness checks. I can control for lots of different things, age, sex, number of children, geographical location, the number of people that live in the camp, whether they had played the game in the past, whether they're, I don't know how they played the game in the past compared to their campmates, the number of relatives or close relatives in their camp, and so forth. It survives all of that. The next thing we ask is whether individuals who are more similar to one another, are they more likely to live together, right? If you're similar in your levels of cooperation, are you more likely to live together in the next year? Again, that would be an assumption of the partner choice models, and the answer again is no. So what we went ahead and did is we calculated again the absolute difference in public good contributions between two individuals, every pair of individuals in the network. So these are individuals who pairs of people who gave the same amount. So the absolute difference was 0. So I gave 4 honey sticks, you gave 4 honey sticks. These are people who are like maximally different. I gave 4 honey sticks, you gave no honey sticks. And this is the percentage of those pairs that will live together the next consecutive year. And what you find is that this line is pretty flat, right? You're not more likely to live with somebody if you had a similar level of cooperative behavior in a prior year. Okay, one concern you might be saying, okay, well, this is interesting, but it's a one-shot game, right? Maybe this game isn't very good. Maybe this game isn't tapping into, some dispositional traits or cooperative characteristic in a person. If you think that there are stable differences between people, right? You might expect then that everyone who knows those people, right, all the people around them would agree on those traits, right? So what we did in 2006, this was work by my then graduate student, Christopher Smith, is we collected ranking data. What we did is we had participants in 12 different camps rank their campmates on character traits, things like generosity and honesty, and also we did it also on foraging or hunting ability. And what this does is this plots the Kendall's W. This is the measure of agreement. It varies from 0 to 1. It's like a measure of correlation. Agreement between individual. 0 is no agreement. 1 is high agreement or complete agreement. And a suggested benchmark for Kendall's W is about 0.3. That means that there's like weak agreement. Anything lower than this, you would consider this weak. Anything higher than this, you'd consider strong. And anything in between these two is like moderate agreements, right? So here they ranked their campmates on these cooperative traits. And the colors here represent the different camps that did the ranking, and then just the size of the circles, not that important, but it's the number of people in their camps that they ranked, right? And what you can see here is that when they're ranking their campmates, like, oh, there's, Katambuga or Juma or something, I think that they're, the most cooperative, and this person's least cooperative, and so forth. There is very little agreement. Who has the best heart? Very little weak agreement. Who is the most honest? Very weak agreement, right? The only thing you see fairly strong or moderate, and sometimes strong, sometimes weak too, agreement is for hunting ability, right? There tends to be more agreement on who is the best hunter. So in summary, the data I presented today, I think, provide little support for partner choice models for the evolution of cooperation, and the data undermine partner choice models in 4 ways. So first, we do not find that cooperators or the Hadza are choosing more cooperative individuals as their campmates. So cooperators are not more popular. 2, we do not find that, similarity in cooperation predicts, future cohabitation, living together. 3, we find that cooperative behavior changes year to year, right? There is little behavioral persistence. People are changing. And we see this reflected in that ranking data too that I just shared with you, that there is weak agreement between individuals on who is most cooperative. So without this behavioral persistence, partner choice for cooperation becomes untenable because there's very little means by which people can, means by which observers, people who are looking for partners, can make informed choices about who they want to be with. You need behavioral persistence to make good decisions. I'll briefly say that there is evidence that maybe this is changing as the Hadza change. So this is a story for another time, but they are a population in transition. So this is just an outside cultural exposure survey that we gave to them a couple of years ago. And the values here just report the proportion of individuals who either said yes or answered the question correctly. And our most, and our data suggests that they are changing. There's a lot more exposure than before, as previously reported. And our most recent work is suggesting that maybe their psychology for partner choice appears to be changing too. But the data that I showed you today suggests that cooperation is something that is flexible. Right? It's something that changes, and it's largely affected by the people around us, our local social environments, that we're not born cooperative, we're not born selfish, right? We don't have these dispositions that are set for life. And these findings are really consistent with, models of reciprocity, number one, but also cultural evolution, where, social learning and norms can generate assortment within groups. But then what happens is that different groups will converge on different norms. Okay, so I just want to circle back to the very beginning of the presentation and to the importance of culture on cooperation. So there is an abundance of evidence to suggest that, we are a cultural species and that we have a psychology that is adapted to the cultural transmission of information. And these things include our proclivity to adopt norms, to punish people who don't follow the rules, norm violators, and of course, pedagogy, right? We know that teaching is very big in humans, as is high fidelity imitation. We're copycats. And all of these things are observed in very young children in diverse societies around the world. And my favorite example of this is imitation. Children imitate adults to the extreme, even imitating those behaviors that are unnecessary to achieve a goal or to complete a task. So chimpanzees, closest relatives, will imitate, but they tend to leave out unnecessary components. And this isn't my work, but I always like to have an excuse to show a video of my daughter. This is my daughter, Maya, and you can see an example of this high fidelity imitation doing everything, even those things that are superfluous to the situation.
Let's put this on here. Ready? Wait, watch Mama do it first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There. Okay, your turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good job.
Okay, I'm going to close with 2 quotes that summarize this work, I think pretty well. The first is by the English philosopher, leader of the Enlightenment, John Locke, who says, "We are like chameleons. We take our hue and the color of our moral character from those who are around us." And the second quote, another keen observer of the human condition, Eminem, who said, "Sometimes I'm real cool, but sometimes I'm an asshole." I think everyone is like that. And these are just my acknowledgements. I've been fortunate to work with really smart people on, all of these studies, and including my former postdoc and grad student, Christopher Smith, who's really been instrumental in the development of the latter work. And thanks also goes to the Hadza, because without them, none of this research would be possible. So I'll end there and turn it over to Q&A. See if I can find my cursor.
Спасибо большое, очень интересная тема. И мы начинаем серию вопросов. И первый вопрос. Подскажите, на какие качества личности влияет кооперация? И как развивать кооперацию, если она низкая?
Yeah, hold on. I'm going to take a seat now. Great question. So it was a 2-part question. The first part was, can you just repeat it one more time?
На какие качества личности влияет кооперация? И как развивать кооперацию, если она низкая?
Yeah, so I would say that we haven't looked at that specific analysis in particular, because we have our measures, our reputation measures for the character traits, and we haven't looked to see if it was correlated with their actual behavior in the public goods game. That could be something that we do. I think partly one of the reasons, maybe we did do that, and I just can't remember. My student had done those analyses, and we did look at a lot of different things. But I think part of it is that we're kind of working under the assumption, given the set of findings that we found, is that there aren't really stable character traits in individuals. And so we wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a relationship, but I'd have to get back to you to see if there was one or not. So if you send me, you feel free to send me an email, and I can certainly do that. And then the second one is that I think getting people to behave, more cooperatively is something that I think is probably best achieved through, the good news is that people are flexible, right? My data suggests that we have this flexible cooperative nature to us. And so developing, strong norms, instilling values in childhood, at school, in the workplace, when cooperation does begin to break down, figuring out what are the ways in which we can sort of change the conversation, right? How can we get cooperation to sort of happen and flourish again? And really what that takes is cooperative acts, right? When you behave cooperatively for one person, it's like a domino effect. They'll begin to cooperate more for others around them. And so that would be, I think social norms is really the way to go, and to get that information out there. So sometimes there can be norms, but people don't always necessarily know what those norms are. So figuring out ways to disseminate that information is probably useful. Is there another one?
Является ли, да, есть, являются ли предрассудки к чужим дискриминация обратной стороной кооперации?
For superstitions and what was Yeah, I mean, one of the sort of paradoxes in human psychology, and maybe it's not really a paradox so much, is that we have this, like, on the one hand, we have this wonderfully cooperative nature where we are so cooperative, but we tend to be cooperative with those individuals who are within our groups, right? And we can very easily and arbitrarily discriminate or separate people into the out group, right? And part of that, so it's sort of this competitive nature on the other hand. And I think part of, some of the story that some people have is that our cooperative dispositions developed in part because of the fact that we were so cooperative within our groups that we fought in part against other groups. And because we were cooperating in that fight against other groups, we did better. So we sort of developed these two sort of distinct psychologies as a result of that.
Являются ли черты кооперации отрицательными чертами? Например, когда люди кооперируются, чтобы совершить преступление.
Yeah, that is exactly what I was just saying in the I was saying in my answer to the last question. Yeah, there can be, I mean, some people think about war, fighting against, other groups as an act of cooperation within your own group.
Корен, а вы могли бы рассказать, с какими трудностями вы столкнулись в ходе проведения данного исследования? Какие вызовы вам пришлось решать в данных условиях?
I'm not sure if they're asking for research challenges or personal challenges. I'm going to guess that that's probably more of like the personal stuff, as that might be a little bit more interesting. I mean, there are a lot. I won't sugarcoat it. No, there's a lot of stuff that is really difficult. I mean, I always in particular found the social challenges to be more difficult than the sort of physical challenges. I thought, like, oh, being, camping, I have to take a tent out there with me and eat food out of a can, and it's a hard life, and it's really hot, and no showering, and that's hard. But that to me wasn't the difficult stuff. The difficult stuff was dealing with, like, in part, like, I had pods of friends, but I was socially isolated from family and friends from back home, and I always found that. And then for long stretches of time, like, having no means to connect and make sure everyone was okay, and share my own feelings and difficulties. And from that's the personal sort of aspect. From a research point of view, I mean, there's quite a few too. Challenges. One is that sometimes you get out there and the things that you think might work, they don't necessarily work. They're not understandable, or they just don't relate well. They don't translate well, and you have to kind of revise on the fly, and that can be very stressful. to do. So that's, and especially when you don't have, your colleagues and collaborators to talk with. So that's one research challenge. Another research challenge, I think that is certainly an issue that I've been thinking about more and more, is that the Hadza, like there's other groups that this is certainly true for as well. They're undergoing this transition. They're really important for lots of reasons. I gave you lots of reasons why I thought they were important for us to research, but there's also this burden that we're placing on them. And in some ways we're, overusing them. They've been participants in, many psychology studies, right? More than that, probably average undergraduate. Many, Hadza people have probably participated in, 10 or 15 studies, psychology studies and so forth. And so there is this, trade-off that you face. You want to get this research and you want to answer these questions, and there's limited time perhaps to do it because they are this population in transition, but you, by doing this research, are also contributing to that change. And it's difficult because you at some point have to start making decisions like, is this research worth it? Or which of these questions would I really like to know? And start thinking about, deciding which are the things that are really worth pursuing and whether we should start prioritizing some questions above others.
Есть ли какая-то связь с тем, какой вид общения у людей? Это общение в реальном мире или общение виртуальное в интернете? Влияет ли это как-то на способности и качество кооперации?
That's not my research in particular. I'm sure that there's probably been some, I don't know it, more recent research, as most things have moved online virtually, but we do know that in anonymous settings, people are less cooperative overall. I mean, I showed you data to suggest that, humans are, good and cooperative in, anonymous situations, but it does begin to break down and fail when, I think we can all see it when there's, anonymous blogs and chat groups and so forth. People can be pretty harsh and pretty mean. And it doesn't always necessarily have to be anonymous either, but I think it's a lot easier to, behave in ways that are less than ideal when you're not face-to-face with a person. These are all great questions, I'll just say, by the way.
Расскажите, есть ли какие-то темы в рамках данного исследования, которые вы в дальнейшем хотели бы еще изучить? Какие у вас есть исследовательские вопросы к себе, к теме?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think like everybody right now, some of my projects that I have been doing have been put on hold. So I haven't been out to Hadza Land, or my students haven't been out to Hadza Land for a couple of years, and we don't know exactly when we're going to be able to go back due to the global pandemic. But some work that, where I'm interested in, or we have a grant on right now that hopefully by the time we get out there, we'll still have the money available to us, is looking at something called the foreign language effect. So the foreign language effect, maybe some of you are familiar with it, but the foreign language effect is this idea that when you give people, if you ask bilingual people either in their, native language versus their, secondary language, you ask them questions, their choices or their decisions change depending on the language you use to ask the questions. So if I were to tell you, I love you in in English versus in Russian, I think it would have a greater impact in Russian versus English for you. And then there are other reasons why you might expect. So it's not just impact and emotional, ties to the language, but there are other reasons to expect that decisions would vary depending on the language. So that's something that's been found, mostly looking at Americans and bilingual Spanish and English speakers, something that's been found here. It's not something that anthropologists typically consider so much. And it's something that I think that they probably should, if we're finding that this affects decisions, moral decision making, and other sorts of decisions. And this is something we really need to be taken into account, especially when we're, running these cross-cultural studies and we're saying, hey, look, this population varies from this population and is different than this population, because the reason why is that although we report this when we're writing up our results, we don't often take it into consideration. So when I run my experiments with the Hadza, I sometimes run them in Swahili. Sometimes if I can get a Hadza research assistant who's really good and speaks Swahili really well, I'll run them and he can do all the translations and I trust him. I'll run them in Hadzani, in their native language. So Swahili is their second language. And sometimes I'll just have both available to me and I'll ask the question first in Swahili and have it just repeated before they make a decision in Hadzani, just to facilitate that greater understanding. And why I will describe the process in my methods of my papers, we don't take these into as a factor. We don't take this into consideration at all. So I will share, when I do these cross-cultural studies with other collaborators, I'll share my Hadza results, say how I got them. The other researchers will do the same. And we're not really paying attention to language at all. And so that's one of the things that we're going to, I hope to explore in the Hadza, is the foreign language effect, something that is universal. Do we see it in the Hadza? Do we find differences in answers based on, the types of how we're asking the question, which language we're asking the questions? And is this potentially, and then getting a couple of other populations involved, and does this potentially lead to cross-cultural differences between groups or generate differences? And should we be rethinking some of the differences that we thought might have been there for other reasons, but could have just been differences in methodology? So that's just one. Let me think if I have some non-Hadza research that I work on as well. I find that it's always, as a practical matter, it's good to have, your hands in the research bucket at home too. And so I have some olfaction studies, smell and attractiveness, with a graduate student of mine who just successfully defended her PhD dissertation yesterday. She's got some great studies that we're now in the process of writing up for publication. So you should look out for those. Really, really interesting stuff on I don't want to get into, I guess it's probably not good to get in and describe a whole research area, but olfaction and mate selection, unless somebody wants to hear, and you're welcome to email me. And then I have another student who is interested in gender differences in competitiveness. So on average, males are more likely to compete than females, and what happens if you give women the ability to practice something beforehand? Does that increase their willingness to compete? The answer seems to be no. Instead, what you find is that there's another sex difference, lo and behold, and women are much more likely to take opportunities to practice over men. So they spend more time practicing, they're more likely to choose to practice and spend more time practicing compared to men, but it doesn't make them, even if they practice, it doesn't make them more likely to compete in a task after. So that's work from my other graduate student.
Может ли вот эта потребность и тенденция женщин к большему количеству тренировок быть как-то связана с тревожностью, которая вызывается общим социальным конструктом, связанным, например, с мифами вокруг того, что женщины неспособны, например, по крайней мере, в России есть такая история иногда. Может ли это быть связано именно с тревожностью?
Yeah, we haven't looked at like individual predictors of how much people are practicing, but I think that that could certainly be part of what's driving this gender difference that we're observing. One of the things, so we have different conditions for the study. That's a great question too, by the way. I'll just say that. We have different conditions for this study. So one might think that, so we give them the opportunity to practice. We say that you'll be given like 5 minutes to practice or something, and then you can choose whether or not to be in this competition. Well, it might just be that we haven't ran the final version. It could be that having a limited amount of time to practice actually makes you more anxious, right? Because you didn't have enough time to practice till you feel like comfortable and like, oh, I finally mastered this, right? So now we're going to be running another study where we actually say, okay, now you have a limited amount of time to practice. And when they can practice until they're like totally fulfilled, what does that do to their levels of competitiveness? Does that actually make them more willing to compete? So I wasn't explaining to you the full study. Right now we're seeing that other finding, but things could change. We could find that practicing when you have lots of time, unlimited time, actually does something for competitiveness. But yeah, confidence, I think, is a big predictor of why women are, at least in the research suggests that it's a big predictor for why women are less, willing to compete compared to men. So confidence explains a lot of that difference, and then differences in risk aversion. So competitions are inherently more risky than the alternative, which is basically the alternative. The way it typically works is that you give participants a choice to either compete against another person, whoever does better wins and takes everything, or get paid based on your own individual performance. So imagine it's a test and you're answering problems, and for every problem you get right, you get $1. And the other one, the competition, is for every problem you get right, so long as you beat your opponent, you'll get $2, right? So in the competitiveness one, you have an opportunity to earn more money, but you also might earn $0 if you lose against your competitor, right? You can earn $0. And then in the piece rate, we call the other one the piece rate scheme, you're getting paid based on your own individual performance. So by definition, it's less risky, right? There's less variance in the potential outcomes, and women tend to be more risk averse than men. And that explains part of the difference. What we were mostly interested in is tapping into confidence, right? By giving women this opportunity to prepare, does that boost confidence and in turn make them more willing to compete? And instead, at least so far, what we're finding is that no, it just makes women more likely to prepare and doesn't seem to affect their willingness to compete.
У каких народов больше кооперация проявляется? У северных или южных? Интересно наличие влияния климата или, например, развитие кооперативных навыков в зависимости от основного рациона и способа добычи пищи, охоты, земледелия или собирательства.
Yeah, so I found a little bit, some stuff with the Hadza that I wouldn't say it was modes of production per se that were influencing it, but there is a little bit of a difference between Hadza who live in the market regions versus that are, groups that are a little bit more isolated in their levels of cooperation. And that's something that's been found in other cross-cultural work, that market integration, the percentage of calories that you get, this is work by Joe Henrich and others, that the percentage of calories spent on food, like that you spend to get foods, it predicts levels of cooperation. And the way he sort of interprets that, or the group interprets that, is market norms, right? Like when you're living in a market, you need to start like trusting individuals, interacting with individuals. People are cultivating these reputations for being more cooperative and so forth in order to do well and to compete with others in the market. So I do see some evidence of that in the Hadza to some extent, in some data sets that I look at. Thomas Tallum, if you're interested in some work, has a really nice, I think it's I can't remember if it's Nature or Science, but you can look him up. He's at the University of Chicago right now, and he has this really nice example that you can look up if you're interested in looking at modes of production in China, between like rice culture versus wheat culture. And I'm gonna butcher it if I try to describe it to you and kind of forget exactly the measures that he used, but he does find a difference in levels of cooperation and other things as well, based on this mode of production that's used. And so that provides like a really nice natural experiment if you're interested in looking at that. That's a good one for you.
А есть ли какие-то возможности для того, чтобы поучаствовать в исследовании билингвов и изучении иностранного языка?
No, I'm sorry, I don't know. Is the person's asking if they can be a participant in the study? I'm planning on only doing this in Hadza land and other like small scale societies. I don't have any plans as of yet, at least, to do it in an industrial population. But it would be really interesting. And if a student were interested in running this in parallel there, not to be a participant, but to actually collect data, definitely send me an email. And I think that would just be a really nice data set to include concurrent with the others.
А есть какие-то прикладные возможности для использования данных, которые вы получаете в исследованиях? Прикладные с точки зрения психологии, развития каких-то отраслей?
Yeah, I do think there is some benefit to knowing how flexible human cooperation is. Imagine if we just did think that we lived in a world where we just thought, this person behaved badly and now we're going to label them and we're going to designate them as bad people forever. I think that this I don't typically go here, but I do think that this type of research could inform sort of policy decisions that one might make about whether individuals can reform, can change, and so forth. So understanding that humans are, multidimensional, we change, we're adaptable, and so forth. I think that can be just pretty powerful knowledge to have.
А как вы думаете, можно ли заметить какие-то изменения, и есть ли смысл изучать разницу в кооперации у представителей разных культур, развитых стран, например, между США, Канадой, европейскими странами, Россией, Японией?
Is that the full question? Yeah, just in general, I don't think that the Hadza are the only population for which it can be informative for understanding the evolutionary origins of behavior. I think all sorts of populations can be informative, and especially I would say that what really matters is that what is it that you're really interested in? What do you think might be driving differences between groups? Are they ecological factors? Are they, cultural factors, institutions, and so forth? And then what you do is you look for variation between groups right? On those traits, right? On those ecological predictors that you think, well, I think this will have an effect. So you look for a population that has this and a population that doesn't have it and a population that might be somewhere in between or so forth. And then you measure cooperation between the, between those, and that's a way to test your hypothesis. So for sure, it really depends on your question, but yeah, of course it can be really, really informative and interesting depending on what your question exactly is.
Лорен, спасибо большое за сегодняшнюю встречу. Наше время, к сожалению, заканчивается. Это действительно было очень увлекательно. Интересно было погрузиться в этот мир другой культуры, мир, где мы можем сравнить разные культуры. Спасибо большое за развернутые ответы. Я думаю, что после сегодняшней встречи...
Yeah, no, this was a wonderful experience, and the questions were all just so good. I'm like, yeah, it's really fun to have fun questions and good questions at the end. So I'm really pleased, and thank you again for inviting me.
Я думаю, что наши сегодняшние слушатели, абитуриенты, студенты уйдут с еще большим количеством вопросов, исследовательских уже для них самих, для того, чтобы, возможно, глубже погрузиться в эту тему и посмотреть, как еще может работать эволюционная психология, потому что это действительно дает более широкое представление, понимание того, как мы работаем с точки зрения эволюционной психологии, с точки зрения социальной психологии. Здесь получается целая смесь коллабораций, потому что, конечно, человек как личность развивается в культуре, развивается в обществе, развивается среди других личностей. И это тоже один из вопросов психологии того, общество и культура, они делают его частью чего-то или могут вырастить как индивидуальную единицу, как личность, и где вот эта вот часть влияния личности, где часть влияния среды, где часть влияния культуры, где часть влияния группы или малой группы семьи, большой группы локальной, в которой живет человек. Это действительно множество интересных вопросов, на которые, я думаю, нам еще предстоит в рамках психологии ответить. Спасибо вам большое, и со всеми слушателями и участниками процесса мы встретимся в следующий вторник, также в 19:00 по Москве, вместе с профессором Стэнфордского университета Энфернальд. Мы поговорим о похожей теме, посвященной тому, как влияет окружение и культура на развитие детской речи. Посмотрим, как в том числе в рамках разных институтов развития разных культур происходит развитие детской речи. Тема также очень интересная, связана напрямую с этнопсихологическим аспектом, поэтому обязательно подключайтесь. И до встречи на следующей неделе. Всего доброго, до свидания.